Welcome, and we're in the Word again today. We are heading into the book of Revelation. Today we have one of those rare days where we have two chapters of reading, chapter 1 and 2 of the book of Revelation. And we're in the home stretch. So God bless you for sticking with it. I pray, and I'm sure that God has used His Word in your life to encourage you and to edify you and to equip you for the work that He's given you to do. We'll be finishing up our road from Romans to Revelation on the 4th of October is what I'm anticipating here. So we're getting close to the end. As we approach the book of Revelation, can be a controversial book. People shy away from teaching prophecy in the church. Some think it's too divisive. Others that it can't be understood. Still others that it's for a future time. We don't have to worry about it for ourselves right now. So oftentimes prophecy is neglected so that when we come to the book of Revelation, it's very confusing because it builds on prophecy that's gone before. Another reason people find the book of Revelation confusing is that we don't understand the Old Testament. There's not a lot of preaching and teaching done out of the Old Testament, particularly books like Daniel, for example, Isaiah, especially the latter chapters, Zechariah, Zephaniah, Joel. The Old Testament is by and large neglected, I think. And when we come to the book of Revelation, just about every 1.4 verses alludes to the Old Testament in some way. So we miss all the richness of that prior revelation that comes in the book of Revelation. So these are the things that maybe cause us some confusion. Lots of different views on what's happening in Revelation. I'll give you my views so you just know where I'm coming from. Again, I'm not asking you to agree or disagree. I just want you to be aware that I take number one, a literal, historical, and grammatical approach to the book of Revelation. So unless it's totally impossible to take a literal reading of the text, that's what I stick with. I understand it as best I can, how it was understood in the first century when it was written. Speaking of that, I take it that this was written by the Apostle John near the end of his life, after perhaps 95 AD or a little bit later. So this is about 5 or 6 years after those books, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Near the end of John's life is where these are coming from. I also understand that the rapture of the church will happen before the tribulation. So I am a pre-tribulation rapturist is what that means. I think the church is no longer on the earth after Revelation chapter 6, on or about. So from Revelation 6 to 19, I take that to be the church is not on the earth at that point. I'm also what's called a premillennialist, which means that I think that Jesus returns at the beginning of his 1,000-year reign on the earth, that he comes and he establishes his kingdom. It's not the mission of the church to do that. The mission of the church is to be faithful to the charge that he's given us, which is to preach and teach his word. So I'm a pre-tribulation, pre-millennialist. I take a historic view, a literal view of this, and keep that in mind as we go through the book of Revelation. We come to chapter 1. Today we're looking at chapter 1 and 2. I've labeled chapter 1, the revelation from Jesus, and chapter 2, warnings to the church. So what we see here in chapter 1 is the risen, exalted, powerful Lord of heaven and earth, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending. That's how Jesus presents himself here to John and through John to us. After all, John is writing down what he is seeing. In fact, as we go through the book of Revelation, you're going to see that sometimes John is so stunned by what he's witnessing that he has to be told, reminded, as it were, to write down what he's looking at. So in verses 1 through 3, we see Jesus is revealing himself, and he's revealing the end of history. That's what he's doing here. He's revealing the consummation of history. Very little in the book of Revelation is actually new. What it does is it organizes and puts in some sort of chronological order prior revelation, prior the progressive revelation of God all comes together here. Very little new revelation comes, but Jesus is putting it in order, and he's telling us how these things are going to transpire. Verses 4 through 7, it's clear that he is writing this to specific churches in Asia Minor that exist at this time. Chapters 2 and 3 will look specifically at who these churches are, and I'll tell you why I think he chose these churches. But these are letters that were written to the church. It's interesting to reflect on the fact that other prophecy in the Bible, Old Testament prophecy, came to Israel. But now prophecy is being brought to the church, and it's being brought to the church by the Lord of the church. Verses 8 down to about verse 20, I'd say the end of to the end of the chapter, John is describing who he's seeing here. He's describing Jesus in exalted terms. Don't get hung up on some of the imagery that's used here that John is using to describe what he's seeing. Focus on the fact, especially as you read through this and just looking for kind of the big picture, is that this is Jesus glorified, just as Jesus exalted. This is not the Jesus meek and mild of the Gospels. This is not the Jesus being taken advantage of and beaten by Jews and Gentiles alike. This is not the Jesus that's submitting to crucifixion on the cross. This is the Jesus that's coming back to conquer and rule. And that's what we see here. He's going to rule his church, and then he's going to rule Israel, and then he's going to rule the earth. That's one way to look at the progression here. Another way is in verse 19. Let me direct your attention there. Jesus tells John, he says, "Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, and those that are going to take place after this." So 3 categories of things that John is to write down. The things that you have seen, we see that in chapter 1, where John is describing who he sees, Jesus. Those things that are, and we'll see that in chapters 2 and 3, that is the condition of the churches. And then those things that are to take place after this. We have an interlude in verses 4 and 5, and then in chapter 6, what's coming is this tribulation. And in fact, the rest of the book is talking about not only the tribulation, the end of it, the establishment of Jesus' kingdom, and then ultimately the establishment of what's called the eternal state at the end. So those are the things that will take place after this. That's a good threefold outline to the book of Revelation. Also look at verse 20 there. It says, "As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand," and you can see that earlier in John's Revelation here when he's describing Jesus in verses 12 and following. He says, the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, or the 7 lampstands, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Pointing this out for a couple reasons. First one is that the book of Revelation is filled with imagery, and that imagery is usually interpreted right in the book itself. So you can look right in the book of Revelation, and most of the time it's going to tell you what the imagery is all about. The other thing is this question about the angels of the churches. Who are they? Some think that these are actually angelic beings. The word there translated angels and angelos simply means messenger. So I take this to mean that these are messengers sent from these 7 churches that I'll discuss in just a moment here. They visited the island of Patmos where John is. The Lord has intervened now, and he is giving warning to these churches on how history comes to an end. And of course, it's been preserved for us in the book of Revelation. Chapter 2, then, I've labeled Warning to the Church. And that's a good label for both chapters 2 and 3. And we see the church of Ephesus, the church of Smyrna, the church of Pergamum, and the church of Thyatira addressed in this chapter. We'll see other churches in the next chapter tomorrow. Why these churches? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, these churches are on basically a mail route. They're on a paved road that goes from Ephesus and loops through this western part of Asia Minor. So these churches are in fairly relatively close proximity to each other. Some have said that these churches represent stages of church history. That the Ephesian church is the apostolic church. The last church that we'll discuss tomorrow will be the apostate church. Perhaps a lot of reformers would point to the Roman Catholic Church. I think that's wrong. I don't think it's a historical picture of what the church looks like. Otherwise, we would be kind of following along and saying, okay, Jesus isn't coming back yet because we haven't seen the church in Smyrna or the church in Pergamum or the church in Thyatira. So, in other words, it destroys the doctrine of imminency, that the Lord could return at any time. I think why the Lord picked these churches is that they have both good points and bad points that exist in all churches at all times everywhere. In other words, these are example churches. These are exemplars, if I can use that term, maybe what we would call a example of a church somewhere at some time, or maybe a combination of features, both good and bad, that all churches, most churches share. Out of the churches that are mentioned here, there's 7 of them. Only 5 are condemned in some way or another. Only 2 are really good churches. So that should get our attention. And as we go through this, and as you read through it today, try to pick out from these verses what's commendable in your own church, what the Lord would praise, and what he would condemn. So let me look at the book, the church in Ephesus in these last few minutes and just give you a kind of a template to apply to the analysis of Jesus' words on these churches. So Ephesus is the first church. This is about 40 years after Paul had established this church in Ephesus. And we usually start with a description of Christ. So by template, by matrix, be as Christ at the beginning, and it describes some particular feature or aspect of Christ that's particularly relevant for this situation at this church. And then it goes on to the commending the church. You know, if you're going to criticize, it's a usual practice to first start out by identifying what's good and what's right, not just going right to criticism. We learn that from the Lord. There's a few churches here that have no thing that the Lord is commending them on, but that's rare. Usually there's some good features, so the Lord opens with his discussion of Ephesus with commending them for their hard work, their toil, their endurance, their discernment. But then ultimately all the churches get to this third phase. They're being condemned for something. So this church in Ephesus is being condemned because they have abandoned the love that you had at first. This could be love for Christ, love for each other, but frankly, if we're cut off from Christ's love, we'll be drying up in our terms of our love for each other. So the church is first, we first see Christ, we see a commendation of the church, then we see a condemnation of the church, and then a correction. Jesus tells this church how to get back on track. It's really important. The Lord has not abandoned most of these churches. He is inviting them to be reforming, that every church needs to be improving. Every church needs to be rooting out sin, and this church is no different. He says, "Remember, therefore, where you have fallen, repent and do the works you did at first." he warns them, if not, I will remove your lampstand from your place unless you repent. So here's the correction. And then finally, each of these churches ends with some kind of call. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So I've gone a little long today. Sorry about that. I'll be wrapping up right now, but as you go through this, take heed to who's bringing the judgment and what he's saying to his churches. And again, reflect on your own church. Where are you doing well? Where do you need to repent? God bless you, brothers and sisters, and God bless you in the reading of his word.